insulation do's and don'ts. We're not necessarily suggesting that everyone glues themselves to the M25, but it seems to have got some reactions because you're all here. It's more about what other practical steps can be taken. So I'd like to introduce Melissa Merriweather, who's another architect, project manager, and a retrofit specialist. Melissa helped write a green building certification system for use in Vietnam and has been lecturing all over Asia on sustainability. Now back in the UK, she's concentrating her knowledge on domestic properties, which are responsible, as we know, we've all been to the previous seminars, for a large proportion of the country's carbon emissions. They're invariably poorly ventilated, damp and difficult to heat, especially my house. She's director of two companies, one's called Hearth and the other one is Green Consult Global. Melissa, over to you.
So just to say that retrofit is my passion now, and my mission is to make it more feasible for more homeowners in the UK to retrofit. It's called putting things into perspective. The climate crisis has been around since the mid-70s, arguably a lot earlier. Apparently, the first mentions of climate change in mainstream media go back as far as the 1920s. But for most people, things only got real when our bills started spiraling into the stratosphere. Domestic heating counts for about 40% of the carbon footprint of the average London borough. As an earlier talk pointed out, heating our homes releases more carbon than our cars. So if you listen to Insulate Britain, insulating our leaky homes is the one-stop shop for solving the climate crisis. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. But despite having a number of don'ts in my talk, there's some do's as well. I believe that the best way to ease climate anxiety is to have a plan. I also believe that the best solution equals the most reasonable solution. So I probably need to issue a product warning. I'm not going to be giving you a recipe for successfully insulating your home. I'm not even going to give you a list of ingredients. It's more a set of issues to think about before you crack some eggs. So second disclaimer, and then we can get on with the talk. If there are 22 million homes in the UK, there might be a million different typologies. Mixed together with different planning departments, climate zones, etc. There are a lot of diverse conditions, so there are a lot of exceptions to everything I might say. English heritage trumps climate goals. Across the UK, planners prioritize historic preservation. They know the rules, they have knowledge of the conservation areas in their remit, and they're there to defend the UK's heritage over and above any practical needs you may have concerning your home. Enter the new kid on the block. The idea of net zero is not even a toddler. There's only a general ambition in the newly released London plan. It's grand, net zero by 2030, and vague. Where there are planning details, where there are details in planning law, they apply to new build, not retrofit. There's a black hole when it comes to retrofit. The little advice we have is on permitted development, on heat pumps and solar installations. Even there, planning departments will disagree about what constitutes permitted development. In terms of insulation, then, it's the Wild West. This is relevant because if you live in a conservation area, you'll struggle to get approval for external insulation, even to the rear of your property in some cases, because there's not yet a UK-wide or even a London-wide playbook, and very few planners want to take the hit for sticking their necks above the parapet. Mainly, it's a lack of up-to-date education. It's very difficult to invent entire new programs when planning departments are run part-time with staff working from home. Having said that, we may have reached the point where homeowners are sufficiently motivated to make change. If you make planning applications that push boundaries, planning departments will have to address it. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, but I think we're going to have to do this until there's a mission change in the UK's planning departments. So this leads me to my main point. The change that you make is the change you can do. So we need to focus on being realistic. If you don't have oodles of money to spend, then it's pointless stressing about it. Like every major financial decision, budgetary planning will help. Also, we need homes we can manage. If a heating system requires a physics degree or we get very stressed out by the hum of mechanical ventilation, we'll ignore it or we'll turn it off. So be realistic about what level of management you can cope with. Some people will jump into this eagerly, and others are like that. Your home is probably complicated. Another thing we need to be reasonable about are old, slightly decrepit, and often frankly weird homes. They're like ancient relatives. They have poor circulation, creaky foundations. Going and putting them in disco attire and roller skates is hardly going to work. A nice cardigan and some woolly socks is more like it for most of us. In other words, deep retrofit, basically gutting your home and completely insulating it top to bottom, is probably not on the cards for many properties. For those not ready to do a complete transformation, insulation is not an easy win. There are a few exceptions. If you own a 1970s property and it's missing cavity wall insulation, well, there aren't many of you out there, but just get it done. There have been some cautionary tales about cavity wall insulation, but a trusted, highly rated supplier will do the work. And the lovely thing about it is it requires nothing additional. Fills the cavity, done. For the rest, it's going to be more of a process. So the key to success is to be frank about your goals and your limitations. Assess your property with all its flaws. So the first port of call is to stop and assess our property as accurately as possible. You need to know what you're working with. Identify anything that's losing heat because it needs repairing and fix it. Badly filled areas around pipework, broken and cracked render, damp problems. Damp in particular requires more from our heating and it can be deadly if you simply insulate over it. So I'm fast coming to the conclusion that one of the best things we can do for our properties is make them more consistent. If you have generally double glazed your windows, but you left a few out, those should be on your short list. If you put loft insulation in one part of your roof, but say maybe not over the rear extension, do that. Owners can often do a very good job of assessing your properties because you're there all the time. You know where it's damp or drafty. You may even have an idea about when installation dates were made, about loft insulation, things like that. So if you do that together with somebody in the building trade, your input's going to be invaluable. Now, while this isn't insulating per se, you really have to do the repairs before you start insulating. Hire a life coach for your house. Get the best advice you can afford. If you ask for a free survey from an insulation company, their goal is to sell you insulation. A double glazing company will sell you windows. I'm here to tell you the window guy is not going to point out that you need to improve your ventilation because the windows no longer leak. Or that you need to look past the window frames to find out that there's bodged 1930s newspaper around the window frame inside the wall. Dots should be joined up, and saving money by going DIY on house insulation or trying to project manage it yourself could be asking for trouble if you haven't got the time or the expertise. Field of Retrofit Consultancy has been developed as a response to poor insulating practice. We assess the house, we speak with owners to understand their budget, we create a comparison of various options, looking at different solutions, the cost, the payback, if there is any, and advising on risks. We can also advise on specification, inspect on site, and check that installation is done properly. It's not cheap, but it can save a lot of money and some huge headaches. The result is a step-by-step plan. It has stages that can match your journey. Alternatively, an architect skilled in retrofit can do this as well as adding design skills and project management. Insulation is a big job, and you might as well do it with other house improvements at the same time. Bring in an architect at that point. Now, if we're talking about new build, then it makes sense to lead with fabric first. Superior fabric minimizes heat and cooling demand. But owners and occupants of existing building stock It's going to be more of an even balance between fabric, tech, and behavior. It's some of the most inefficient housing in Europe, and we're paying for that. Sorry, not Europe any longer. But it's really not possible to reverse years of neglect of our housing stock in 10 years or even 20 years. So I believe that we should focus on practical, actionable, medium-term plans rather than focusing too much on net zero. It's a fantastic goal, but one that could make a lot of people feel very disorientated from the get-go. So it's perhaps not that. Wrapping all our properties in a thick cocoon of insulation is great for some, but it's probably not going to wash with most of your local planning departments, and it's going to bring with it a whole host of other problems. For external insulation, these are all problems that need solutions. We've got a very narrow roof overhang, we've got a huge soil pipe, we've got some really beautiful brickwork there. And there are other problems that only appear years after installation. If you can't see that, it's desperate levels of mold. So it's absolutely critical that we use the right materials to insulate. We choose insulation that works with our existing issues, and we don't create new problems through insulating that weren't there before. So Nellie spoke about natural insulation, and I'm on that bandwagon 100%. I want to say that I totally agree with using low carbon materials where we can. If we're doing this at least partly as a way of mitigating climate change, then we don't want to be loading up with petrochemical based PIR boards. So we've got this range of insulation, lots of lovely products. Again, she's got some samples over there. I showed aerogel, I showed diathanite, I showed wool bat. There's some blown cellulose, which is a paper product. I've got a wood fiber board up there, and glass mineral wool, and just up on the right-hand corner, that's your PIR board. I'm not gonna try to remember what PIR stands for. So this is the technical part of my talk. Sorry, I guess those numbers aren't really going to be very easy to see, but I'll explain them. I do a lot of energy modeling. So this software lets me test out various improvements on my clients' homes. For example, I'll take your standard average Victorian wall, 260 millimeter thick of solid brick. And then I'll test what happens when I add different insulations to it. I'll add 40 millimeters to start. Maybe I'm using that lovely insulating plaster. That's 40 millimeters. Okay, it's not very thick. Then I could do something, so I could test something more radical, maybe 60 millimeters of wood fiber plus some plasterboard to finish it. That's going to take me to about 85 millimeters buildup. So that's how much I'm building up the inside of that wall. Okay. Or I could really go for it. 100 millimeter of glass wool back between some timber framing, finished with a couple layers of plasterboard, skin coat paint. Now I'm up to that. Okay. And I show these because you have to imagine if I'm putting that around all the features of my house, then I've got to figure out how I'm doing that. Because I haven't just built a cube. I've got a complicated house. Okay. So the interesting thing is that I get diminishing returns too. That first 40 to 50 millimeters does a lot for me. And as I'm adding in more and more millimeters, each extra millimeter adds less. I could theoretically install 200 to 300 millimeters of insulation, but my data shows me that the first bit is the most important. Maybe up to 80 millimeters or 100 if I'm externally insulating. But internal insulation is probably on the cards for a lot of you. So if I'm an architect and I'm trying to build a passive house, or I'm doing a deep retrofit, like an interfit type project, I'll put in the amount of insulation that gets me to the goal. Natalie was working with software that helps her figure out exactly how thick that insulation needs to be to get to her goals. And I'm all for it on those projects. But we're not really going to get to net zero with our typical Edwardian terraced house on the typical budget. So I look at it like this. What's my biggest constraint? Is it that I've got internal features that are going to be very difficult to work around? Is it maybe I've got some uncomfortable decisions to make about having to extend my roof verge if I'm going to externally insulate? Do I start losing valuable internal floor area? That's true for a lot of flats and smaller houses. Do I have a limited budget? That's most people. Or planning restrictions. So I work to constraints. I try to do the best I can within my constraints. There's no abstract perfect solution here. There's a solution based on reasonableness. And what that chart shows is that you've got the top bit is 40 mil, then 85 mil, then 125 mil. And I get savings compared to the original house. My savings in heating costs or energy costs overall, about £500 a year with the 40 mil. And then it adds about £123 extra when I get to the 85 mil. When I go all the way to the 125 mil, it only reduces me another 80 pounds. So as you can see, I'm getting thicker and thicker insulation. Overall, I'm still improving. I'm just improving less and less. The other thing, and Natalie did mention this, insulation requires ventilation. I'm just going to drill down to that for a moment. So new building regulations were issued this summer, updating our requirements for ventilation. The more we insulate our homes, the more critical it is to have good ventilation. Now, I'm working on a kind of formula now where if I lightly insulate my home, maybe I don't even insulate the walls, which I'll explain a bit more about later. But if I go for a light package of insulation, then I might be able to get away with trickle vents and other kind of passive ventilation. That means that I've made the whole house more insulated, more airtight. But I'm not losing sight of the fact that I still need to ventilate. We still breathe, we still emit liquids, and these need to go somewhere. And I've seen a lot of homes that have double glazed. That's all they've done, and they've got problems. They've got mold problems. They've got damp buildup. So we do want to be getting that ventilation. And if you go to a very well-insulated home, really piling that on, then we do need to go to a mechanical ventilation system. And yes, there are ways of getting that less energy using, but the crazy thing is that then a mechanical ventilation system, even with heat recovery, can just about wipe out all my energy savings from my insulation. That's kind of shocking. It's more comfortable by quite a bit, but in terms of just simple energy reduction, it's not making the numbers work. So another point is don't partially insulate. So don't do that ground floor insulation and forget the upper floors. Now let me explain that really well. We want less is more, not less is less. It's really easy to create thermal bridging by poorly installing insulation. Thermal bridging can occur a number of ways. Again, Natalie showed some good photographs of that. The more complex the home, the more difficult it is to insulate without creating thermal bridging. So if you haven't gutted your home and you're working around lots of features, you've got to be very careful about this. So for instance, say you have a fancy cornice at the top of your living room. You're going to have to take the cornice out. You've got to insulate up beyond the cornice into the floor void above. You can't just stop at the cornice. You've created a massive thermal bridge where your cornice is. So don't do that. As for insulating one wall or insulating part of the house, the only exception that I can think of that's suitable is if you have, say, a kitchen extension at the back, it's a cavity wall, you could insulate that separately, or maybe insulate the rest of the house and not that because it's performing fairly well. You still have to be careful not to create thermal bridges where that extension hits the main house. But it's a lot less problematic than partial insulation elsewhere. So thermal bridges would be fine on their own if they just created heat loss. We just turn up the heating a little. It's not perfect, but it's not a major disaster. But they bring another set of problems. They create this imbalance in temperature between different surfaces. That creates moisture buildup, and that creates mold. And it's usually happening where we can't see it and we can't get to it. It's the underlying reason for black mold appearing on insulated properties around the country. I've seen some really dreadful examples of this. So well-meaning insulation creating really not very good situations. If you have a situation where you can't insulate, say, both your external facades, if you're in a terraced, mid-terraced house, or all three exposed facades, if you're on if you've got a semi-detached property, or pretty much the whole house if you're in a detached property, then if you can't do that, I would consider very, very carefully what your next moves are, and get some really good advice. Okay. Now, you don't have to insulate your whole party wall, by the way. You do have to bring the insulation back into the party wall. But if a fitter tells you you have to insulate the whole party wall, they're just trying to sell you insulation. Oh, one other thing, on flats. I don't know how many flat owners we've got here, but you have to be even more careful if you're insulating a flat because obviously you've got a boundary with your neighbor. So where you stop, you're probably creating a thermal bridge for your neighbor. We've advocated insulation on a few flats, but we take a very light touch in those cases. Okay, this slide is good time. Internal insulation or external installation, and I bet you can't really read that very well. So internal insulation and external insulation is a lot of times that's going to be a factor of whether you're in a conservation area or not. But internal insulation is going to be better if you're in a conservation area. It's going to be more possible. You can install it sparingly in flats. It can be installed regardless of season. It leaves those external features intact. And if you're making major renovations, it can be a lot less expensive than external insulation because you don't have to deal with scaffolding and so forth. And it's invisible if done well. However, it requires removal of your skirting, your cornicing, your window frames, your wallpaper, your kitchens, your bathrooms, and reinstating them. Your family might have to relocate. It's slow, it's messy, it's dirty. There's a greater risk of thermal bridging than with external insulation. And if you've got complex and highly considered internal decorations, they could be much more expensive. External insulation is better if there's few or no period features on your home. It can be installed while you're occupying the property. It's quicker installation, generally. There's better air tightness, and on average, better U value. So you're creating a better thermal package. It can be cheaper compared to interior if your interior has a lot of period features. But it's going to be prohibited in conservation areas, especially in the front of the building, probably the side. Natalie talked about brick slips. That's a possibility in some areas. Some areas aren't having it. And there are some conservation areas where they won't even let you do it in the rear of the properties. It's season dependent. It also might be difficult to install if you have poor access at boundary lines, you have soil pipes, drains, that kind of thing. These things can be really problematic to deal with. There's always solutions, but you need to look at those with a gimlet eye. You also have to reinstall all your windows and doors into the line of the insulation. And it can be unattractive. It's not to say this stuff isn't good to do. Let's just be aware of the pitfalls. So I'm not going to cover any more about installation. And I suppose what might seem a long list of negatives here, I just want to remind you that the takeaway should be less is more. It's a positive one. It's more budget friendly. It reduces many of the headaches that we associate with insulating properties that were built to breathe. So do the most you can do, but don't sweat it if you can't do a lot of insulation. You might actually be doing your property and yourself a big favor. So I'm going to give you a few other little cheerful ideas, quickies that are nice takeaways. So here's a little shopping list. If you have a conservatory and it's connected to the rest of your home by internal grade doors, can you live with external grade, draft-proof, double-glazed doors instead? Conservatories are hands down the biggest energy hogs, and insulating them is near to impossible. Next, after you've done the external grade doors, install a TRV on the radiators in your conservatory, if you have them, or zone them so that they aren't heated along with the rest of the house, or don't heat your conservatory at all. Loft insulation is cheap and easy to install, so it's okay to err on the generous side. And for many homes, loft insulation is the biggest insulation improvement you can make. But many people have partially insulated lofts. I have so many clients that say, oh, my loft is insulated. Don't worry about that. And I go up there and, part of the insulation smashed down with boards so they can have a nice place to put their suitcases, and it's just missing in other places, and somebody forgot to reinstall that when there was a leak, and also they haven't insulated their loft hatch, which becomes like a thermal bridge up to the loft, especially if it's going up a nice central staircase. It's basically taking all your hot air up there with it. So insulate your loft hatch. It's the one place I'll recommend a PIR board because they're cheap and you can cut them on site and you can fit them snugly. And if you're in doubt, get somebody else to do it. Draft proofing, another great friend of mine. So underfloor insulation, by the way, is not a game changer, although fitters may try to convince you of that. If you have leaky floorboards, sand and fill them. You do need underfloor insulation if you're putting in underfloor heating. If you have old timber windows and you can't afford to change them, spend a little of your hard-earned cash on getting them professionally draft-proofed. DIY stuff tends to warp and tear after a while, and unless you're a pro fitter, you can end up with windows that don't close. While you're at it, the door, letterbox, possibly your cat flap, all need draft-proofing. Stuff a chimney sheet up your open chimneys. They stop a pipeline of heat loss. Do not do this if you still use your chimney for heating purposes. Whoop. Double glazing, almost the same as Natalie's slide. Might be the same in reverse. Expensive, but it's a game changer. This is a thermal image. On the left, we've got our single glazing. On the right is the double. Don't just get somebody to fit the windows. Get a builder to check that you don't have gaps around your windows and fill those gaps while you're having the windows installed. Most people feel much more comfortable in their homes with double glazing, but you don't need triple glazing unless you're building a zero energy or extremely low energy house. Installing them as a retrofit can create a thermal imbalance between your walls and windows. This is to join up a little bit with an earlier talk, okay? And I recognize that this part of my talk might be contentious for some. I'm open to debate on this issue. There are quite a few opinions out there, and this is mine. Waiting for the perfect time to invest in a heat pump is a little like waiting for the perfect moment to invest in solar, something James debunked in his talk on Sunday. You need to improve your property as much as is reasonable before you install a heat pump. So that will buy you at least another year, probably, in most cases, maybe more than that. This technology is going to continue to evolve, but that shouldn't stop you from planning to install one in the near future. We don't not buy an iPhone because in 10 years' time, it's going to be an old model. We buy when we have the funds, when other people are doing it, and when there's sufficient infrastructure. Most heat pumps, though, are engineered for new build, and fitters trained for those heat pumps will refuse to install a heat pump in a retrofit in a property that does not perform similarly to new build. In other words, well insulated all round. If you have solid walls, we find that a fitter experienced in retrofit, this is a heat pump fitter, okay, experienced in retrofit could make all the difference. The heat pump will be a little larger than it would be in a perfectly insulated home. But you saw photos of a 9 kilowatt model in the talk on Sunday. Even a 12 kilowatt model is not much bigger. Although do be aware that larger units may exceed the dimensions of permitted development, and that would trigger a planning application. Very boring. In my opinion, there's often a strong case to make for a slightly larger heat pump versus more expensive and disruptive insulation. I like balance there. Okay. In my opinion, we find that a heat pump is viable on most properties that have the following things: double glazing, loft insulation, draft-proof doors, floors that aren't too leaky, with a fully separated conservatory, if there is a conservatory, and cavity wall insulation to any later extensions. If there's a room in the roof, that does need to be insulated. Flat roofs or sloped roofs on rear extensions that don't have lofts should be insulated. But the idea that the house must be completely insulated on all exposed walls isn't true. And though quite a long list, many of those improvements I just mentioned are much more straightforward than the whole house insulation and less expensive. As long as you keep a balance, and as I say, you're not putting in triple glazing onto a solid wall, you're doing a light touch all around. Whack as much loft insulation as you want. Whack in that roof insulation, not a problem, but keep an even hand around the property. We find that actually a heat pump can work quite well. So once the property is heat pump ready, the impact of the heat pump is major. It's going to reduce your energy use far more than insulation will on its own. Because of this, I want to see, it's going to reduce your energy use and your carbon footprint. Because of this, I want to see more people get their homes to just good enough for a heat pump stage. I believe this will get us farther down the road to net zero faster, with lower financial demands and fewer complicated planning issues to place undue burdens on households. Again, I don't want to undermine those of you who are willing and ready to do a deep retrofit. Do that. It's a fantastic thing to do. But this is for the majority of the rest of you. So we talked a lot about fabric here, talked a little bit about tech, and I just want to include one quick slide about behavior to join up the circle. I also want to make a nod to the overall goals of this really lovely, holistic, and balanced program of talks put on by the Herne Hill Forum. The different topics are not separate solutions, and while some ideas might not work for you, you should consider them all together, since together we work better. Planning bigger improvements takes time, commitment, and money, but behavior is important too, and it's a start now, low or no cost vision. Sorry for the small talk, but I've shown a number of quick fixes that can help bring your bills down. So just a minute to run through the list. Okay. Turn your thermostat down. Of course, that's no good if it's already, if you're already at 12 degrees. Of course, if you're already setting it to 18, see, I said, or going for periods of time where you're really chilly, that's a ship that's passed. But a surprising number of people don't know what a big impact 1 degree makes in your setting. It can be as much as 10% of your heating bill. Other small things add up if you use smart controls, and I mean properly using them. Use your dishwasher rather than hand washing with lots of hot water. Run your laundry on a colder, shorter cycle. I've been working on that one, and it's really quite great. My wool socks don't shrink anymore. Replace your old fridge with a new model. Please do that. Add an aerator to your shower head. reduces the amount of water going through, but it keeps a nice flow. Unplug your appliances when you're not using them, etc. So this could take off another 5 to 10% of your overall bill with careful management. Okay. So in conclusion, hopefully I've done a bit of myth busting. Myth busting, we got that out, about insulation. Apologies if you're hoping for a DIY manual. I'm sorry, there are some really useful books out there though. But this is one area where the expense is large enough, you want to do it right, and you want to be aware of the consequences and the knock-on effects. Okay? I've got a screenshot here of news from the Home Builders Federation, which notes that there's a sea change going on now with buyers now interested in the EPC and heating requirements of the properties they are buying. A few years ago, this was not on the table. I used to go around to estate agents and said, no, our clients aren't interested. They don't want to improve their homes. So, but we're in the midst of a revolution here. I hope homeowners with existing properties can be convinced to participate in this revolution. If we aim for reasonable goals, who knows, maybe. So the case for insulation is not going to be made by payback from lower heating bills, at least not in the short or medium term. But there is a strong case for if we also consider the long-term viability of our properties. We're investing in those properties. We also get better health from better internal environment and simply more pleasure from our homes that are comfortable. If we have extreme energy price rises continuing from now, then the investment might just pay back on its own terms. But honestly, I wouldn't wish that scenario. So thinking about it holistically is probably better. I just want to end with one final word on reasonableness. For me, the best things to do are the things we can do. My climate concerns tell me that I need to start now, not in 5 years. And I don't want my property to be saddled with a poor EPC that leaves it unrentable or unsellable. So I'm going to concentrate on the most viable improvements with the most impact for my pound to get to a reasonable one. And as technology continues to improve, my home will be able to harness that technology and not be left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, that was brilliant. We're going to take some questions from the audience. If you could just wait for the microphone to actually start here, and then we'll slowly move across. We'll reach you over there shortly.
Okay, thank you.
That's all right.
One thing that was mentioned to me before about external insulation, one of its advantages is that as well as reflecting heat back into the home, it actually reflects heat out as well when it gets hot in the summer. So I don't know if that's something that people should consider if they're on the borderline when you follow your matrix of whether it should be internal or external.
It's a really, really great point. And I think that leads into the idea that your house is going to be much more comfortable. I couldn't really talk about overheating here because I didn't really have enough time, or my words couldn't be managed into the right package so that I could add that. But the fact is that if you're going to insulate for heat, you're also insulating for cool. There's a few other considerations, but that's right. I think external insulation is probably the better bet there. If we want to keep heat from going in windows, we have to put external shutters or awnings. We can't put in internal curtains. So it's a little bit the same with the insulation, or can be. It's a little less dramatic than that, but same kind of idea.
Yeah, thank you. Really good talk, thank you. What you said about DIY draft proofing resonated with me because I've tried and failed many times with leaky doors and windows. But you talked about professional draft proof. Is that a thing? Where does one find a professional draft proof?
They're like magic fairies. I don't know where the ones in your area, but basically what they'll do, for instance, is they'll take out your timber window, they'll route a line all the way around, and they'll put in this nifty little brush fixture, which is very long lasting and works really well, and you get a really smooth action rather than the plastic or silicone gizmos that, which is dreadful. Anyway.
Next question we have. Oh, The gentleman in the red.
Window suppliers will sometimes do it.
Thanks for the talk. You touched on it kind of, but there are a lot of people who live in terraced houses, and they've got the real challenge of the party wall and presumably potentially creating thermal bridges with your next door neighbour who doesn't go through the same process as you'd like to.
That is one of those hurdles. That's why I'm saying you really have to be looking at all these potential issues very carefully. In our dreams, everybody on the terrace does the same thing, right? But this is where you're better off again with the light touch of insulation. If you don't create too violent a contrast, then often you can get away with it. And if you think about it, a lot of terrace houses, you'll have the entrance on one side, and then you've got maybe a bay window going over. If you're bringing your insulation back into the party wall a bit, you may find that at least on the one side, on the door side, you've got really less of an issue of creating a thermal bridge there. So because you're really going to be getting inside.
Here, then I will go across the far side.
Hi. You said you shouldn't insulate one wall and not another because it would cause thermal imbalance, but you can insulate the ceiling as much as you like. Does that not cause the same problem?
Roofs are a little different. So maybe, I don't know if this works, but I'm going to use Natalie's use of outerwear. If you were going to go out and you had one choice of garment, frankly, I would aim for a hat. Yeah, and in our houses, heat's rising, so you want to keep the heat in. You don't want it all to go up. So that's why that's very important. It also doesn't seem to have as much thermal bridging effect or effect on as a knock-on on the other parts of the dwelling below it. It's just a little bit of an anomaly.
Yeah, throw it back and then we'll go across.
Hi. Yeah, we just had somebody to look at placing our windows in our house, and the windows now all have to come with their own ventilation in. And just referring back to the first talker's mention of a good ventilation system as part of, we're also looking to insulate externally. Does all these the vents on the windows, does that sort of compromise the thermal efficiency of insulating when you've got vents on every single window?
Right. So Natalie talked a little bit about this, but I'll just add a few points because this is very confusing for a lot of people actually. And it's interesting you said that the new windows are now coming with the vents, because I just had a client who called me up in panic because having installed windows about a month ago, they've already got damp and mold inside because they didn't have enough ventilation. So if they're starting to put them in, that's a responsible window installer. Yeah, well, Part F was updated this summer, so that should be kicking into gear now. There's still reputable unreputable suppliers out there, and we have to be on the lookout for that. But I'm thrilled if we don't have to stress that point too much. So anyway, the deal with trickle vents is this. Natalie was talking about unregulated and regulated ventilation. That's what this is about. Those trickle vents deliver a small amount of ventilation, and it should be calculated for the room size, actually. You can do a basic calculation as an architect, window fitter, whatever, that says this room needs this much ventilation. And there's a size of trickle vent that corresponds to that.
You did say that the size would change depending on the size of the room.
Correct. Whereas if you have something like a chimney, it's just going up the chimney. We don't have any real control over the volume of that ventilation. Okay.
Thank you. Far corner.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I really appreciated the pragmatism about the balance between heat pumps and depth of ventilation. That's really helpful. One question I've got is, it's partly to do with conservation area framing. I don't live in the conservation area, but just in terms of the hassle factor and the shape of the house, I was wondering about external wall insulation at the back and then just double glazing at the front. Internal insulation can be really messy. Is that a stupid thing to do? On the basis, would that be essentially just all the heat just go out through the walls in the front, or is there some, again, pragmatic balance I could do in that situation?
That's a really tricky one. And I suppose if I could just make it easy for myself and say, don't do that. But there probably is a case for doing that on certain properties. Again, I wouldn't go hell-bent on the insulation in the back. I would treat that fairly lightly. But for instance, if you've got a big open plan, I think that could be problematic. But if you've got intervening walls and you don't have all that much, active flow through, you might be able to get away with it.
Got the green hat.
I live in a block of flats on the 3rd floor. When I moved in, it was pre-insulated, but the floor wasn't done. If I insulate the floor, I don't have access to the flat above to do that one. Am I just sending heat straight up, wasting it?
Flats, you don't really need to worry about floors in flats. Okay? The only time you would is if you're over a shop or something where, it might be empty for periods of time and it's basically what we call partly heated. If you're above a flat, you get the benefit of their nice heat coming up through your floorboards. Then you're donating some of your heat upstairs. It's a very communal, loving thing. Yeah.
Gentleman back there.
Thank you. 2 questions. What do you do about the Victorian habit of having a very vertical arrangement with lots of stairs and landings and things? So you basically get a sort of internal chimney effect there. That's the first question. Second question is about rooms in roofs, where the tendency seems to have been just to put rafter depth insulation, which seems to be much, much thinner than anything that's suggested anywhere else. So those are 2 things, basically.
Okay, so the internal heat evacuation chimney that we call stairways, absolutely make sure that your loft hatch is insulated and that your loft is insulated if all you've got above that is a loft. Then the story kind of stops there. You're still going to get rise up, but most people can't start sectioning off that stairway. I used to be an architect, but I don't do that anymore. That's somebody else's problem. But your loft hatch, good idea. Do that. Now, the other one you were talking about is room and roof. Yes, it's true that a lot of those room and roofs were insulated on the slope, and that's going to be thinner insulation. Not an easy thing to solve. It could be a combination of lining the internal walls, which are made like a little box in that room. That's actually fine. You can insulate that with just about anything, frankly. And if you've got some money to spend and you don't have much space, go for aerogel. I think aerogel is really cool. It was developed by NASA. It's very thin. But you can use lots of different products because it's not solid wall. It's an internal wall, internal space. Okay. But the other idea is to get into that space. I've had a couple of friends with really tricky, really weird room and roof situations where they've carved it out basically to be as tight fitting as possible, but they've still got voids in there. And I've advised them to do blown-in cellulose, which is like a reverse vacuum cleaner. You just throw in a bunch of lovely puffy cellulose bits, and then it settles down. They blow some more in, and then eventually it fills up, and it's quite useful. Yeah. So it really depends on the room and roof and what the objectives are, but there's a couple ways around that.
But you wouldn't advise taking off all the plaster and making
Or you could do that.
I'm just wondering.
It does depend.
Last question there?
Thanks for the talk. Really appreciate the very pragmatic advice, which is great. You've talked a lot of people talking about external wall installation, and there's been a few mentions of conservation areas. Maybe you could talk about some successes where it has been possible on the back. I mean, what caused it to be possible? It got by the planners. I think there was some mention of existing render. I think I'd be interested to know about any cases where you managed to get external installation past the planners.
Natalie seems to be doing that. You need a very good architect who's gonna fight your patch, right? And this is, I had a very early slide where I was talking about this. It's really important for people to take their ideas and their projects to planners and push at the boundaries of this. Because right now, the planners are doing, probably another great slide where she showed her head in the sand. That's what they're doing right now, because they are understaffed. But if they get overwhelmed by us, they're gonna have to supply more planners who know what they're doing. And it just needs to shift. I have spent some time in the last year talking to planners who say, nope, not gonna be any external insulation on the back of these, houses. I don't care if it looks like the back end of a bus. It's ours and it's made of brick. So we need to be pushing that envelope a bit. And they won't do it unless we try.
For what it's worth, we had the planning session at the Carnegie Library, and the feedback we've had from the Lambeth planner and the Southwark planner is they are both not quite in a state of shock, but they realise that their policies have to change. And the Southwark one has actually come back and said, we'd really like you to kind of run past our new policy with you all and see what you think and give some feedback and things like that. So collectively, we can start pushing the planners to shift their view, and they realised they were playing catch up. They were very honest. It's very good to kind of hear that.